Hello and welcome to my comments on your Google Hangout 4 for the group that included Stefanie, Randi, Kenneth, and Todd. So with Kenneth facilitating the discussion, very good job on facilitation. Thank you. I thought you had really good saturation of topics and transitions from one person to the next. And I think you started with the question on interoperability. And Randi is the one that took that one. And what I really liked, no other groups really got to the discussion on interoperability as far as federal frameworks. And your group at least started a conversation on that. Specifically, Randi talked about the National Contingency Plan that was created in late 60s for how to deal with marine spills and hazardous spills on the water bodies. And with respect to that, it is really important to keep in mind that, and Randi did not talk about it, but you brought out that National Contingency Plan, which is old. And then we have been operating, at least since Homeland Security presidential directives and on domestic incident management, under the National Response Framework. And as you know, the National Response Framework is the model for domestic incident management. So here suddenly you had an event that occurred where National Contingency Plan was activated. And yet everybody in the Gulf, as far as governors and elected officials and people in emergency management, have worked under the framework of National Response Framework, specifically post-Katrina. And this is the region that was particularly vulnerable and still in recovery of Katrina from 2005, when we're talking about those events on 2010. So when you have National Response Framework, what gets activated is the Stafford Act and all those rules that determine the assistance of the federal government to the states and the role of the federal government in coordinating the response, and who is a principal federal official and all those things. But also equally important is that under the National Response Framework is the incident command system that has applied with the function of a safety officer. And the problem with using National Contingency Framework and National Response Framework in a very disjointed manner during a Deepwater Horizon, the function of a safety officer for response operation fell through the cracks because there was no formal safety officer designated for the Deepwater Horizon, which caused all kinds of issues related to first responders, not only your traditional first responders that were part of a response, but also all the ones that got folded into it, which were regular citizens who were boat operators. There was a program, if you read in the report, called Vessels of Opportunity that was launched by the BP. They were paying money to those people in the region that were affected by the disaster as far as economical impact on their businesses, and yet they were boat operators, and they could help BP, and being paid for it, in the response efforts. But because there was no safety officer, all those issues coming out with hazards that were inherent to that response were not properly mitigated because those two frameworks were mutually did not sync. They were not what's called crosswalked at a time. National Contingency Plan being very old, again, Randi mentioned that, and the National Response Framework being this modern approach to domestic incident management. So in a way, we have the all hazard approach, all hazards, but the contingency planning for the oil spills. So of course, your group discussed, and I think Randi started that, the fact that oil industry is one of the highest risk industries, and that the issue of oversight was really missed here in this event, and the fact that there are the resources for compliance on safety and security measures certainly did not match the need. So you discussed about the fact that there was one inspector for compliance for 55 facilities in the region, which definitely points to really huge gaps in the ability to provide oversight and regulatory measures. And of course, the fact that, with that, you don't have enough expertise, you do not have enough capability, and you'd cut corners. So the inspections were not conducted. And certainly, it does not help that BP historically had a very poor safety record. Even the explosion in Texas, raised a lot of concerns about their safety and their operating procedures and their response to that particular explosion in Texas City. So as Randi mentioned, certainly the cultural issues of the BP, the lack of syncing between two different national frameworks. So as far as interoperability, the inability to provide oversight to a very, very complex field, complex domain with a very high risk component, all of those created a domino effect, and with no redundant systems in place. Of course, there's another point, and I think you brought up, is that the people that work in the oil industry are already living with inherent risk, and they get paid for it. So the philosophy of the culture of looking at safety standards and precautions is perhaps a little bit different than in other industries where people don't get hazard pay. So when you get hazard pay, it's expected that you live with the hazard, so to speak. So they occur in such as the initial explosions, certainly. So we're talking about the Deepwater Horizon as critical incidents within critical incidents. And the initial explosion being one, the inability to respond to it properly is two, and then the inability to close the leak is number three, and then the inability to mitigate or respond to the spill is four. So you've got all kinds of different issues in this very, very complex event. But certainly, can you start talking about the public, private sector and the public-private relationships? The private sector comes with profit. This is their essence of being, and the bottom line. And their priorities are about saving money or mitigating the economic losses to their operations. And there were, of course, the entire operation was already running behind timelines, over budget, and losing money. So safety regulations were overlooked in an effort to speed up the processes and also, move the process along faster because of economic impact for the company itself. Stefanie, you talked about the probability. Some of those events, those really, really black swan events, because this is definitely Deepwater Horizon was a black swan. Not that it would be that it would be unexpected, because when you do innovative technologies and when you are pushing the boundaries of exploration, which this was the case, this is the first time exploration was happening at that depth. Certainly there are risks involved, and then those risks are very, very, very low probability maybe, but they are very, very high consequence. So with that, when there is very little oversight, that's not a very good combination. When you have those very, very high consequence events that are black swan, and then you have lack of safety practices and this organizational culture and the frameworks that are not synced, all that adds to the equation of catastrophe. And of course, Todd, add to that, the culture of, employees being sort of, taken for granted in a way that they are economically remunerated. So their concern for their safety or well-being perhaps is not the same and as, somebody working from Google, for example. So you had a good discussion here on that interoperability. The only thing that really you did not touch on is that syncing of the two different frameworks. And so I wanted to bring it out, particularly with the role of safety officer. So that led you to question 2: should the private and the public had an equal partnership in this decision making in domestic incident management? And of course, you discussed about, you talked about all the points that would sort of go against having a private entity that had the equal ability to make decisions in the management of that event. Poor safety record, repeated mistakes, the fact that BP had really poor assessment of risk initially, that they also did not have the capability technologically to cap it, did not know the amount of oil that was leaking, and of course, not integrating the existing, or not heeding research and research component. And Stefanie mentioned the fact that the executives in those private industries, in this case specifically, did not engage the community. And I think this is really, really important for a variety of different reasons. One being that we are talking in domestic incident management about the whole community approach, but we're also talking about who is the expert. And we often think that, yes, in the oil exploration industry, the experts are going to be the people that work for that industry, or at least we would expect them to be. Public institutions are going to have lower expertise. As you saw in the report, the mineral services could not catch up in their ability to hire experts that would be able to assess properly if those safety measures were in place. So you have experts, the subject matter experts, but you also have a knowledge in those communities on their economies, on their relationships, on their politics, on their vulnerabilities, on their experiences. And this is very critical, that decision making, that it's about the region, within the region that's impacted possibly for years to come, that those voices do matter. And unfortunately, a lot of times those private components or private operators, again, have totally different priorities than public government or public organizations that are there to serve the public good, because you have money and then you have public good. But this is ever more so important when we are talking about those private operators, that they understand the community and that they heed the community and that they use that community knowledge, because as Stefanie very rightly noted, those people in the community might not be researchers and might not be experts in a particular scientific field, but they have, operation-based knowledge on historical data on how the businesses ebb and flow in that community. And that is something that cannot be dismissed, and certainly was not taken into account in this event, or not taken into account properly. So Ken was talking about, I think Ken did a really good job trying to drill on some of the questions and follow the discussion through. So, I think he directed you to the issue of trust with respect to private companies, and And again, you had a discussion on how to hold them accountable if those governmental institutions do not have the knowledge to hold them accountable. Certainly, if you have an issue, and that goes both for national security and homeland security, and goes for terrorism and all the other aspects of threats and hazards, the fact that private industry has proprietary information that they might not want to share for a variety of reasons, such as patents and intellectual exclusivity. And certainly there was a big case with Apple and FBI investigations in San Bernardino, but in Deepwater Horizon, that's a case of Nalco and EPA. EPA, being a regulatory environmental agency, does not know exactly the components of the product correxit that was dispersed with dispersant, because there is a formula that at some point is very protected and very sensitive. So with that private operator, you have that element of some trade secrets they protect as well, because it's the essence of their being. So could they be an equal decision makers? I think that that's a really relevant concern with information sharing for them on their side. I think that was it. That was all you had on the issue of equal partnerships, and you moved to question number 3 on trust and erosion of trust in the sort of logically flew in the community, and you talked about compassion, open communications, honesty, access, and transparency, so people know what to do. And I really like that part of the discussion because it underscores something that we have discussed even with respect to other aspects of intelligence. For example, the Homeland Security Advisory System, when we looked at that and what are the actionable items for people for protective actions, and is messaging to the public, if you see something, say something, what does it mean for people, what are they supposed to do, what kind of responsibility do they have, and what kind of communications need to be issued to them. So certainly this part of dissemination of information and intelligence, both dissemination is really critical. What kind of information gets released specifically in the area of risk communications. And of course, if withholding information, I don't know who said that, but it was really good. Withholding information always leads to trust going out of the window. Certainly, there is going to be some information that is critical to ongoing investigations, that there are privacy issues and things like that. But in risk communications, when it's about the protection of the public, and here, both the public in the area, but also the emergency responders and all those volunteers that were folded into the response, those communications certainly were not transparent, and community was not involved. So you talked about kids waiting in possibly toxic water, and the reporter was told to turn off camera. So very, 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 very old school approach to no information. We can't release it. We are living in a society that has instant information available through different venues. So if you try to cover something up, most likely it's going to come out under the other side of the carpet. So Todd talked about information sharing, in policing, and sometimes, this bottleneck to where there is a lot of information available in the top levels of the organization, but the people, the boots on the ground, really don't know much about the big strategic picture. They're supposed to do the things they're supposed to do, but a lot of times they they are missing the big picture, and communications sort of narrow down as you move in the different layers of organization. And I think Stefanie had some of those comments on that earlier as well, that, you know, those leadership decisions are not always explained or communicated properly. I think that with the trust issue here, the sort of information I was going for with particular Deepwater Horizon was that again, those because there was no safety officer assigned formally by the organizational structures of response, then there was no vetting process on how those responders, in what conditions they were working, what protective actions they needed to take. There was some kind of HAZWOPER training that was given, but, you know, if you're taking Vietnamese speaking, and a lot of foreign languages were spoken by the boat operators, and they were getting this crash test on HAZWOPER that, you know, was of very limited value to them in raising their awareness of potential consequences of participating in that response. You know, all those issues compound the problem later on, and certainly a lot of people not being able to have a recourse, because if you don't have a baseline of somebody's health or vulnerabilities prior to participating in a response, then you can't measure the cause and effect, so to speak. And so that was definitely very poorly executed in Deepwater Horizon. And again, going back to National Response Framework and National Contingency Plan, all those governors and state emergency managers, you know, the directors of Homeland Security and Emergency Management for the region, they operated with a National Response Framework. And they were extremely disenchanted and extremely upset that there were some other framework that was in practice with them. It caused a very huge distrust between the government officials in those affected jurisdictions and the federal component. Any area that already is very has a very eroded trust in federal government to start with post Katrina. So those were, you know, sort of additional elements of information sharing, or importance of whole community approach, integrating the channels or frameworks, crosswalking them. So the question on precautionary principle, and so Stefanie brought out the definition, very nice, on safeguarding marine ecosystems, minimizing human impact or activity at source. And you even had some comments on Corexit use not allowed by certain countries, certainly not by Britain. If you look across the European Union lists of dispersants, Corexit, some countries do have Corexit on the list, some don't. But I think that the important thing with Corexit here is that there are different, on the precautionary principle, you have different levels of dealing with that spill. One would be mechanical or skimming. One would be a burnout, which is a little bit more toxic for the environment and release of all those compounds. And then the top shelf is Corexit. And so while some countries in Europe might allow Corexit, it would be in extreme cases and only if all the other methods fail. In some regions, for example, in a vulnerable ecological spheres like Baltic, those dispersants are not allowed, and mechanical collection of oil is the way to go. And that's, so I would argue, if you may, that the Gulf with the mangroves and with the fauna and flora and fisheries, and, you know, the way it sustains several states in fisheries and food production and stuff like that, that it's a very important ecological zone. And so while the Baltic has those precautionary measures in place, we do not. And that was a very nice summary of that, Stefanie. And of course, Randi was mentioning about the fact that the capping happened very late into the game, so they couldn't even stop the leak. So certainly now you've got all that stuff that floats on the surface, and you have a private company that's losing not only millions of dollars, but they're also losing a public image. As the minutes progress and the whole world is watching that slick big thing on top of the ocean, that is really, really bad PR for them. So they went for the most aggressive way of dealing with it, because their priorities were a little bit different. They were not necessarily environmental and ecosystem, or decrease the activities at the source, as Stefanie mentioned, but it was more of the maintaining, balancing the act of maintaining public trust of people in the company. And yeah, this is, I think you had some thoughts, Randi and Stefanie. You talked about long-term effects of, with precautionary principle, when you have those low probability but high consequence events, their immediate impact of them might not be revealed after years. So it's very longitudinal. So that's another way when you assess risk, you're looking at not just the immediate impact, but the impact over time. Very hard to predict, yes. And I think you mentioned Agent Orange and the impact on, entire generation. And then, all kinds of genetic mutations in fish, shrimp, and marine life that happened because of a spill. Not to mention economic tourism impact on Alabama and Mississippi, Louisiana, that rely very heavily on tourism too, with Mississippi being one of the poorest states in the nation. I think you had a very short mention of the fact that BP was on a manufacturer board of Nalco. I would say that this is an issue with Nalco, proprietary formula of that particular dispersant. Because of its composition, exact composition, is not known, because it is, intellectual property. Obviously, that's an inherent issue with a private developer. And Nalco is made by a Texas company. I mean, Nalco is a Texas company that makes Corexit, and certainly regionally very strong lobbying for it. But post Deepwater Horizon, there was a bill to eliminate Corexit from the allowed suppressants, from the allowed dispersants to be used, and to remove it from the EPA allowed agents, like some other countries have. And that bill had a lot of public support and a lot of lobbying and a lot of advocacy, and then it just got jammed. And again, when we go back to policymaker and the longevity of a political will and policy window for making change, availability of research, all those are very important in sort of connecting at the right moment to form a policy. Unfortunately, the bill on Corexit never went through. The question number 5, I think, was asking about risk communications in a case of Ebola. And the question specifically asked about importance of the intelligence cycle, and specifically analysis when we look at the intelligence this semester, as compared to the case in Dallas County on the Ebola case in the United States. And the question was it as important? I think Stefanie was mentioned that it's the same thing. This was intelligence, and I loved it, because we truly getting here into the essence of Homeland Security intelligence. What is Homeland Security intelligence? Homeland Security intelligence is just that. It's a process of looking at the exploitation and analysis and dissemination, sharing, feedback. There is not a whole lot of difference between how we look at that covert or int, SIGINT and HUMINT and all that, with the way we should address other issues such as epidemics in the United States. That's where this Homeland Security enterprise comes in. And certainly, analysis is a huge part of it. Analysis is as critical when you're dealing with domestic information about hazardous this with, foreign threats and looking at terrorism issues. And I really like that. And particularly with that dissemination phase, if you don't have proper analysis, you do not know what actions to take, protective actions to tell people to take. And again, if that risk communication process is not there, you don't have the entire cycle of information sharing or producing actionable, good information, implementing it for decision making, requesting feedback and improving your actions for the next event. So that was really, really brilliant. And from that, you went into the, how do you educate people if you do not have good risk communication protocols? And certainly CDC during the outbreak had very conflicting messages. So that caused, one is to think we only had one case in the United States. What would have happened if it actually was an outbreak? If it was an outbreak, the response would have been a total failure. And of course, you mentioned Todd talked about the media and the education of officers. You mentioned SARS and the protective equipment for officers. I think a huge part of the epidemics awareness or risk communications is, the law enforcement is not always integrated because we focus so much on the active shooters and terrorism and that those other aspects of intelligence or information sharing, particular risk communications are not as well covered or trained or disseminated to first responders. So overall, I really liked your conversation. Ken, again, thank you for having it run smoothly and nudging the and getting some of the follow-up to the questions from participants. And then, of course, question number 6, who is the best at deception in your group? So let's see, I learned a lot about you guys from that session. So we had, let's see, Kenneth, let's see, we talk about fishing, woodworking, business, and skydiving. And I do not think, Ken, you were a good liar or good at deception. You got made out, and some of the class members got your lie. So as being a skydiving instructor, I think. Then we had Stefanie having 2 different eyes. Oh, since you were able to see one another, your group pretty much figured that one out. Being the oldest, being left-handed, and military experience. I think you are not a good liar either, because people pretty much made out your which one was your lie. Randi talked about being in Carnegie Hall, not have read the book until she was in high school, broke one bone in 6 different places, and traveling outside of Texas, or traveling traveling internationally, maybe. I was really, I really did not know, wouldn't have guessed your thing about reading a book until you were in high school. That was a really good one, and makes you aware how, we can make assumptions, right? Because you're quite comfortable with reading now and consuming huge amounts of graduate work or graduate reading. So kudos on that, and thank you for sharing that with us. And Todd, 2 kids. Of course, we know you're from Dallas. And playing tennis, 2 dogs, married 8.5 years. I think, you sort of really, really good at telling, the truth, not really good at telling the lies either. So I would say that everybody took you on a tennis thing. So I guess, Randi, you might have it there, that ability to to have a different legend or a different agenda that it seems. So I hope it was fun for you this semester. I know that I still owe you the Google Hangout free feedback, which got stuck in the pipeline, with different projects coming on. You will receive it before the semester is over. I have all my notes on it, so I'm just gonna do a session for you before the semester is over. But thank you for your participation. Thank you for being collegial. Thank you for working well as a team, taking responsibility for the readings and having good discussions. And I am looking forward to seeing your final papers. Cheers.